Hi, greetings, brothers. My name is Adigadu, and I'm the teaching leader of BSF Jakarta Evening Men class. You are listening to the study of People of Promise, Exile, and Return, Lesson 21 of our year long BSF study. Today, we will continue to explore together the scripture in Zechariah chapter 9 to 11. We will look closer at the first part of God's message through Zechariah's last visions in that book. First of all, I want to say that I'm always grateful that you are here to listen to this lecture together with your discussion groups and all the other brothers during the class. And if you are listening to this by yourself, you should know that everyone else has listened to the same lecture. This lecture is an important part of BSF's fourfold learning experience, and I hope this is helpful for you this week. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this lecture. We are going to learn our passage this week in three parts. The first part is a ruthless conqueror, the protected people, Zechariah 9, 1 to 8. Second part is the same king, two radically different rivals, Zechariah 9, 9 to 10, 12. And the third one is 30 pieces of silver, the price they put on their shepherd, 11, 1 to 17. Let's start with our first part, ruthless conqueror, a protected people. Last week, in the midst of an ongoing negotiation, Israel, assisted by the United States, started a war by bombing Tehran, the capital of Iran. Now, Iran is sending missiles to U.S. bases in more than 5 different countries, triggering the state of war with all of them, because that is the best strategy for them to survive this attack. A wide-based war has started, and this is bad news. So, let me start with a question that some of us might have asked at such a time like this, such a time of bad news. Who is actually in charge here? For once, let's not do this as a theological exercise, even though we are now in BSF and you are all good students. And most of us in this room would give the correct theological answer without much hesitation. It's God. But instead, let's try to slow down and try to answer this question in a practical, lived sense. When you watch what is happening in the world around you, governments are making decisions that seems to have no wisdom at all behind them. Powerful people escaping consequences, punishment of their evil personal acts that should have caught up with them a long time ago, as we see in the case of Epstein file, when we see good people suffering things that they did not deserve. Do you actually feel in your gut that someone reliable is holding all of this together? Or does it feel more like things are just happening and all we can do is just to try our best to stay on the right side of whatever comes next? So we are in luck this week because that gap between what we say we believe about God's sovereignty and what we actually feel when life gets chaotic is exactly the gap that God's message in Zechariah 9 is designed to close. God knows and addresses our concerns. Zechariah writes in the 6th century BC to a people who had every reason to feel that gap acutely. They were a small community, has returned from exile in Babylon, living in a city that was still being rebuilt, surrounded by empires that could erase them without much concern or difficulties. And into that situation, God gives Zechariah a prophecy that reads like a news report written 2 centuries before the event of that news happening. So verses 1 through 7 move through a list of kingdoms and cities that any person in Zechariah's world would have recognized as the dominant powers of the region. Hadrach, Damascus, Hamath in Syria, Tyre and Sidon on the coast. Tyre in particular was, which everyone agreed was untouchable, built partly on an island, surrounded by water, protected by walls that rose over 40 meters from the sea. Tyre was the kind of city that military commanders looked at and decided to go around that. Then the Philistine cities, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod. One by one, in Zechariah, the prophecy announces their fall. Their wealth, their walls, their long history of civilization, none of it survives. Approximately 200 years later, Alexander the Great marches south from Macedonia. Damascus falls. Then Tyre, the untouchable city, falls after a 7-month siege in which Alexander engineers a causeway across the open water to reach the island fortress using the rubble of the mainland city that has been destroyed as his building material. Then the Philistine cities in sequence. The correspondence between Zechariah's prophecy and Alexander's campaign 200 years later is so precise that the only way to dismiss it is to argue, with very little evidence, that Zechariah must have been written after Alexander. The prophecy simply knows too much for it not to be a real prophecy. But here is the verse that changes everything in verse 8. But I will encamp at my temple to guard it against marauding forces. Never again will an oppressor overrun my people, for now I am keeping watch. Alexander, who showed no mercy to Tyre, who crucified the governor of Gaza, this same man approached Jerusalem and then stopped. The historical record is clear. Jerusalem was not destroyed. In the middle of the total conquest that swept everything before it, one city was left standing, not because of its walls, not because of its army, because God said so 200 years before it happened. Think about what this means for the question that we are starting with. Alexander did not control this outcome. He was, without knowing it, being used as an instrument in a plan that had been written before he was born. The most powerful military force in the known world at that time was being moved across the ancient Near East like playing a piece of chess on the board by a hand that Alexander could not see and would never acknowledge. And this is what fulfilled prophecy actually does when you sit with it long enough. It is not just an interesting piece of ancient history. It is evidence, the kind of evidence that speaks to the gap between what we say we believe and what we actually feel. Because when you see a prophecy written 2 centuries before the event it describes and fulfilled with that level of precision, you are not dealing with a coincidence or educated guessing. You are dealing with a God who genuinely stands outside the flow of time, who genuinely holds the movement of nations in his hands, and who has not once failed to accomplish what he said he would accomplish. And here is the thing about a track record like that. It does not just belong to the past. It reaches forward. The God who directed Alexander's entire campaign while simultaneously holding that campaign back at Jerusalem's gates when it is at full speed. That God is keeping watch over your life today. The same words that close verse 8 are still true. I am keeping watch. So the first principle is this. The promises God had already kept are the only solid ground for trusting the promises that he has yet to keep. Our first principle, the promises that God has already shown himself to keep are the only solid ground for trusting the promises that he has yet to keep. We do not trust God into the unknown on the basis of a feeling or a hope. We trust him on the basis of what he has already done. Zechariah 9 1 to 8 is not an ancient curiosity. It is a piece of God's track record laid open for our inspection, and the track record is perfect. So, what is one situation in your life right now where you are struggling to believe that someone reliable is actually in charge? And what would it mean to stand on what God has already proven rather than standing on how things currently feel to you? Maybe it is something in your work, situation that feels out of control, a future that feels uncertain. Maybe it is something in your family. You have prayed for many years for a relationship to heal, or a trauma, or an illness. Maybe it is just the background noise of living in this world that seems to produce more chaos than order. For all of those real situations, the question is not whether God is capable. Zechariah settles that. The question is whether you are actually letting the track record that he has with you, the understanding of verses like what we are learning today, plus the memory of his power in your life, of the deep experience that you have with him, whether those memories and those learning do the work that they are meant to do in your heart, or whether you are by yourself continue to carry the weight of the uncertainty that he has already given you sufficient reason to lay down. Let's go to the second part. Second part is about the same king with two radically different arrivals. Zechariah 9:9 to 10:12. And most of us had this experience of expecting one thing and getting something else completely different. It is not necessarily worse, just different in a way that our expectation could not fully accommodate. And when that happens, and the most natural response, human response, is not to question the expectation, it is to question the thing that arrived. And Israel exactly did that with Jesus. And Zechariah, writing 5 centuries, 500 years before it happened, describes both the arrival and the rejection with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable to read. Verse 9. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, but lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Four things are declared about this king in a single breath. He is righteous, morally without defect, unlike every ruler who has ever held power in human history. He is victorious. The word carries the sense of one who has been given salvation to bring, who arrives already carrying deliverance for his people. He is lowly, not accidentally, not despite his identity, but deliberately and intentionally, out of his will, humble. And he arrives on a donkey, not a war horse of a conqueror, but the working animal of a man who has come to serve. In the ancient world, the distinction between a war horse and a donkey was not subtle. A king on a war horse was coming to take something from you. A king on the donkey was coming to give something to you. The choice of animal was a declaration of intent before a single word has been spoken. So 5 centuries after Zechariah writes this, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. Matthew quotes verse 9 directly. The crowd responds with palm branches and cloaks spread on the road and shouts of Hosanna. And within the same week, the same city is shouting for his crucifixion. The king arrived exactly as Zechariah described and was rejected, in part, precisely because he arrived the way Zechariah described. They were expecting a war horse. He came on a donkey. And the gap between the expectation and the arrival was something many of them could not cross. But Zechariah does not stay in verse 9. Verse 10 moves forward without warning. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. This has not come yet. War horses and weapons have not been removed from the nations. Universal peace clearly has not happened. What Zechariah is describing here is the second coming, the return of the same king, and this time in the mode that nobody will be able to misread, not the quiet arrival of a servant on a borrowed donkey, but the undisguised return of the sovereign whose rule will cover the entire earth. Verses 11 through 17 fill out what this return will accomplish. Prisoners freed, God's people strengthened against their enemies, the Lord appearing with the sound of the trumpet, his people sparkling like jewels in a crown. These images point both to historical moments, the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jerusalem temple by sacrificing a pig on its altar, and whose brutality eventually provoked a successful Jewish uprising, and forward to the final deliverance that Christ's return will bring. History has already given us previews. The full picture is still coming. Chapter 10 then sets up a contrast that runs through the rest of the passage. On one side, idols that speak deceitfully, diviners whose vision are empty lies, and shepherds who oppress the flock they are supposed to protect. God's anger burns against them. On the other side, the promises of a God who actually sees his people, who promises rain and harvest, who says, I will care for my flock. And then verse 4 gathers everything into four images that describes exactly the king who this caring God has sent. He is the cornerstone, the foundational stone that the whole structure either stands or falls on. He is the tent peg. In an ancient household, the central pole driven into the ground on which the family hung their most valuable possessions. Remove that peg, and everything falls. He is the battle bow, the warrior who fights on behalf of his people when they cannot fight for themselves. And from him comes every ruler. No authority exists anywhere that has not been delegated from his hand. The rest of chapter 10 then repeats something 12 times in 8 verses that I do not want you to miss. The word I. God says, I will strengthen Judah. I will save the tribes of Joseph. I will restore them. I will signal for them. I will bring them back. 12 times in 8 verses. This is not an accident of grammar. This is a declaration of what God is promising. It is declaration that what God is promising here is not a collaborative project between He and you, where He helps people who help themselves. It is entirely His initiative, entirely His work from beginning to end. Now, here is where this touches us directly. Most of us are not carrying a donkey versus warhorse expectation in quite the same form as the first century Jerusalem, but most of us are carrying some version of the same gap between what we expected and what God has actually given us. We expected that following Jesus would make life more manageable, and it has not felt that way. We expected that being now a good man, a responsible father, a faithful worker, a diligent BSF students or leaders, we would produce visible results. And sometimes it has not. We expected that the cornerstone would look out more impressive from the outside. And in that gap between our expectation and reality, the temptation is to quietly just supplement the cornerstone with something else from ourselves that feels more solid. Chapter 10 is asking us to name what we have been using as the actual load-bearing element in our lives. Not something that we would share to our group in the Bible study maybe, but what we are actually leaning on when things get difficult. It might be our career, it might be our reputation, it might be our standing in our family, might be our ability to keep things under control. The sense that if we work hard enough and make smart enough decisions, we can build something that will hold. Those are, by itself, are not bad things. But those are 10 packs that we were never designed to carry the weight of our life. Zechariah 10:4 is not offering Jesus as one option among several. It is declaring that there is only one cornerstone, one tent peg, one battle bow, and everything else, under realistic pressure that we are facing now, will eventually show that it was never built for what we are asking it to hold. So, our second principle today is that every promise God has made and every hope we carry finds its only center, its only reliable center in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Not partially, but entirely. So, our second principle today, every promise God has made and every hope that we carry finds its only reliable center in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And it is not partially, but entirely. The same Jesus who came quietly on a donkey to die for sinners is coming back to dismantle every weapon ever forged and establish a reign of peace over the entire earth. He is sufficient for both, which means He is sufficient for whatever you are carrying today. So, where have you been quietly asking something other than Jesus to carry a weight that only He was built to hold? And what would it actually look like to actually transfer that weight today, not in theory, but in practice, to Him? This question is worth stating specifically rather than generally. It might be the anxiety about your financial future that you manage through control rather than trust. It might be the weight of your family's well being that you carry as though it were entirely your responsibility. It might be your sense of worth as a man that depends on keeping your performance staying high enough. Again, none of these are wrong concerns, but there is a difference between bringing them to the cornerstone and quietly building on them by your own lone strength. Zechariah is an invitation to feel the difference between the two. Now, our third part, 30 pieces of silver, the price they put on their shepherd. Zechariah 11, 1 to 17. There is a kind of gap that most of us are familiar with, the gap between what we say we value and how we actually live. We say we value our health and then eat in ways that contradict that saying. We say we value our family and then gives them whatever energy is left after everything else has taken its share. And we say we value honesty and then find ourselves shading the truth when the cost of full honesty feels too high for us. The gap is not usually the result of deliberate hypocrisy. It is the result of the accumulated weight of small decisions made under pressure that gradually reveal what we actually believe matters most. And over time, those small decisions add up to something that looks a lot more honest than what we would say if someone asked us directly. And Zechariah 11 is about exactly this kind of gap, played out at national scale with consequences that lasted 2,000 years. The chapter opens in verse 1 through 3 with imagery that deliberately overwhelming. The cedars of Lebanon, tallest, strongest trees in the ancient world, symbols of permanence, stability, and majesty. They are consumed by fire. The oaks and junipers falls. The shepherds wail as their rich pastures are destroyed. The lion roar as the lush thicket of the Jordan is laid waste. Everything that signified strength and abundance is being stripped away in sequence. And the question the imagery is designed to provoke is simple. What on earth could produce this scale of ruin in God's own people? Verses 4 through 6 answer without delay. God commands Zechariah to shepherd a flock that has been marked for slaughter. The buyers slaughter them without guilt. The sellers profit without remorse. The shepherd do not spare the sheep. This is a picture of a people whose leaders have been exploiting them rather than protecting them. And God declares that He will no longer shield these people from the consequences of their collective choices because they have rejected the shepherd that He sent them. What followed in verse 7 through 14 is one of the most striking enacted prophecies in all of the scripture. God instructs Zechariah to physically take up the role of the good shepherd. He carries two staffs, one called favor, representing God's covenant protection of his people, and one called union, representing the bond that held the nation together. He cares for the flock, particularly the most vulnerable among them. He removes three corrupt shepherds, representing the failure of Israel's prophets, one, priests, two, and rulers who had led the people steadily away from God. And then the flock turns on him. They despise him. He grows weary of them. The relationship deteriorates beyond repair. Then comes the transaction that Zechariah describes with devastating precision. He asks for his wages. They pay him 30 pieces of silver. Under the law that God has given to Moses, 30 pieces of silver was the amount of compensation owed when someone's ox gored another person's slave to death. It was not a generous wage. It was not even an ordinary wage. It was a statutory price assigned to the life of a dead servant, the lowest formal valuation that the law recognized for a human being. And this is what they paid the shepherd who has given everything to care for them. God's response in verse 13 carries a weight that's hard to miss. Throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. There is sarcasm in that. Zechariah throws the silver to the potter in the house of the Lord. He breaks the first staff, favor. God's covenant protection is formally withdrawn. Then the second staff, union. The internal coherence of the people fractures. We now exactly know how this was fulfilled. Judas Iscariot sat down with the chief priest and agreed on a price of betraying Jesus, 30 pieces of silver. When Judas threw that money into the temple in remorse, the priests, unwilling to return it to the treasury because it was blood money, used it to buy a potter's field. Matthew quotes this prophecy directly. The Good Shepherd, who came righteous and victorious and lowly on a donkey, was valued by the people he had come to rescue at the legal price of a dead slave. The consequences that followed were not distant or abstract. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 produced suffering that Josephus, who witnessed its aftermath, described as without parallel in human history. The temple was leveled flat. Over 1 million people died. The Jewish people were scattering across the earth in a dispersion that lasted nearly 2,000 years. The breaking of the two staffs was not poetic language. It was a description of a rupture that reshaped human history. Verses 15 through 17 then introduce the figure who fills the vacuum left by the rejected shepherd, a foolish shepherd, raised up as the direct consequence of the people's choice. He does not seek the lost. He does not care for the young or the injured. He does not feed the healthy. He devours the flock for his own gain, a personal corruption from his own power, tearing off their hoofs. Figures like Antiochus Epiphanes and the Roman commanders of AD 70 has partially embodied this role, and we know that there are modern leaders of the world that also embody this role today. But the language points beyond all of them to the one the New Testament calls the Antichrist, the final worst shepherd in human history. And when he falls at God's command, his arm withers, his right eye goes blind. So you see, the worst leader the world will ever produce is still subject to the one who holds everything. Now, I want to come back to the gap described at the beginning between what we say we value and how we actually live. Because the 30 pieces of silver is not simply a historical detail about Judas. It is a picture of what happens when that gap is allowed to grow and grow unchecked over time. Israel did not wake up one morning and formally decide to value their Messiah at the price of a dead slave. They made a long series of smaller decisions about which voices to listen to, but what kind of king they actually wanted, but what they were willing to pay for, and what they were not willing. And those decisions accumulated into the transaction that revealed with terrible clarity what they actually believed the Good Shepherd was worth. The false shepherd of verses 4 through 9 made this easier. They told the people what they wanted to hear. They validated the expectation that were leading the people away from their true shepherd. Rather than challenging them, they accumulated influence and comfort while the flock drifted. They encouraged rage and fear that is not well founded. And the people followed them, not because they were obviously wicked, but because following them was easier than following the shepherd who asked more of them. The pattern is not hard to find in our own world. Leaders who pretend to care were practicing self interest. Religious figures who demand sacrifice from the flock while spending those sacrifices to increase their own comfort. Men who carry the title of husband or father while giving their families whatever is left after everything else has been served. The slow accumulation of small compromises that, over time, adds up to a life built around something other than what we claim to be building it around. Zechariah 11 holds up a mirror to that drift, not to condemn, but to show with the particular honesty that only a passage this precise can offer what the gap costs and what it cost the people around us. And we arrive on our last principle today. Principle is how you actually respond to Jesus, not in a single decision, but in the accumulated weight of your daily choices, is the most important things about your life. So our second principle today, how you actually respond to Jesus, not in a single decision, but in accumulated weight of your daily choices, is the most important things about your life. It's not what you say about him. It's not the correct answers that you give when someone actually asks, but your revealed preference that is revealed in where your time goes, in what you protect most carefully, in what you are unwilling to surrender, and in who in your life gets the best of you, rather what is left of you after everybody else is taking it. The 30 pieces of silver was not a sudden betrayal. It was a conclusion of a long drift. And the invitation of this passage is to look honestly at the direction of the drift before the staffs break. Now, if someone who knew you well, not just your public self, but your actual daily life, if someone like that were asked what you genuinely believe Jesus is worth, what would they say? And what is that answer that you want them to give? This is not a comfortable question. It is not designed to be. But it is an honest one, the kind of question that a passage this honest deserves. Most of us are carrying a gap between what we say and how we live. Zechariah 11 is not offering condemnation for that gap. It is offering a warning. but where that unchecked gap will lead, and an invitation to close that gap while there is still time before the drifts become a departure. Zechariah 9 through 11 was written for ordinary people trying to make sense of a world that felt too big and too chaotic for any framework they had to hold it together. That has not changed much. The passage does not offer a technique or a formula. What it offers is simpler and more durable than that. A God with a perfect track record, a king who is both sufficient for today and certain to return, and an honest mirror that shows us the gap between where we are and where we need to be. The God who wrote Alexander's campaign in advance and held it back at Jerusalem's gates is keeping watch over your life right now. His track record is the ground you stand on. And the king who came quietly on the donkey and is coming back to dismantle every weapon ever forged is the only foundation that will not shift under whatever you are carrying. He is the cornerstone, the tent peg, the battle bow, and he is enough. And the good shepherd who was valued at the price of a dead slave paid infinitely more than that to bring you home. The question is not whether he's worth it. The question is whether the direction of your life, in the ordinary weight of its daily choices, is saying that you know that. Thank you for listening to this lecture.